We could, for example, in Northern Ireland, which is a problem that I think deserves more attention than it's getting at present, try and have a conversation with the government south of the border. And I know they were very nervous about the Brexit outcome. I was there just before the referendum. And say to them, can we find a way of shifting the tax and tariff border from the land frontier to the sea frontier while not disturbing the political arrangements? I think it's in everyone's interest to have an imaginative discussion about where we could go.
Well, you mean basically having a customs border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain? And
a tax. There's no reason why the rate of corporation tax in Northern Ireland has to be the same as in the rest of the United Kingdom once we have the freedom to do that, having left the European Union.
But that is quite a radical idea, because that is bringing a great separation between the nations of the UK, well, isn't it?
Not in practice, because in practice most of the companies in Northern Ireland are very small companies. You can certainly say to any big one that pretends to relocate to Northern Ireland, show us the factories, show us where the employees are. If there aren't very many, then small and medium-sized companies in Northern Ireland could pay the same rate of corporation tax as in the Republic. And one of the things that struck me when I was governor was how little economic activity straddled the border. Most of the trade between Northern Ireland and the small businesses there was not with their counterparts in the south, but with their counterparts on the mainland. And actually it's in everyone's interest to rejuvenate the economy of the island, both north and south, and the banking system too. But what my point is a general one, which is there are opportunities here that require imaginative thinking. And what worries me at present is whether it's the civil service, whether it's politicians, everyone is saying, oh, it's throwing up their hands and say, we can't do this, it's all too difficult, too complicated. I don't believe that to be true, but it will require some serious leadership and a real intellectual vision of what we're trying to achieve.
You've written a bit about how the public, in a way, were voting against experts and the expert opinion when they voted for Brexit. And you are one of those experts. You are one of those people. What is your current feeling about experts? Because it's experts who are going to have to do all this imaginative thinking. Are you suggesting that they're letting the country down at the moment?
No, I don't think that. But I think the idea that someone says that 80% of economists think this or think that, you don't get 80 different views or opinions formed independently. You're getting a consensus view from a group of people who've got one perspective on the issue. And I think that the big problem in the campaign was that experts allowed themselves to have their views misrepresented. In other words, the idea that anyone could know that we'd all be £4,300 worse off if we left the European Union was absurd. No one can be that confident or that sure. There were arguments on both sides, and what economists should have done was to frame the arguments, say, well, there are arguments for, arguments against. But what happened in the referendum was that both sides said the only arguments are on this side or that side. And I think most people that I met who weren't experts or weren't taking part in the campaign were completely appalled by the fact that no one seemed to be willing to say, well, there are arguments on both sides. But for me, the decisive one, either to stay in, is this argument, or to leave, is that argument. And we never had that kind of referendum campaign.
I mean, in some ways what you're saying could be taken as a criticism of George Osborne, whose Treasury, under his guidance, came up with this famous figure of how much each household would lose if we left the EU.
We in the UK need to do something about our trade deficit. It's almost 6% of GDP. This is a massive figure. And my biggest worry about economic policy in the next few years, not Brexit, it's about how we can reduce the trade deficit, how we're going to save enough as a nation to pay for our pensions, because the pension scheme has deteriorated over the last 25 years, how are we going to save enough to pay for care for the elderly when we will become so old that we need that support, how are we going to finance the NHS? These are the big economic challenges.
Briefly talk about Scotland, which you mention in your book. You say it would have been perfectly viable as a nation at the time of the last referendum. Project Fear perhaps was overdone at the time of the last referendum. The oil price is much lower now. The revenue Scotland would derive from oil is much lower. Do you still think Scotland would be viable as a nation?
Well, of course, Scotland certainly could be an independent country. There are plenty of small countries the same size as Scotland. Scotland has both the people, it has the capital city, the history, the culture. It could be an independent country. The question is, does it want to be, given the consequences of it? Now, I myself don't think there are any major problems in terms of currency. That was the thing that Project Fear focused on last time. But there is an issue about public finances. And if the oil price remains low, and if they lose the money which is transferred from the rest of the United Kingdom to Scotland, then they would have to make that up in their own budget. But that's a consequence of deciding to be financially independent. You end up paying for yourself. And it would be a challenge, I think, to borrow on the international market if Scotland decided to run a large budget deficit. I think that would be expensive. The interest rate would go up. But that's one of the consequences of saying, look, if we want to be independent, we have to accept the consequences.
So in a way, it's good news and bad news for the SNP, if you like. Good news, perfectly viable. Bad news, there may well be an economic cost that you'd have to bear.
And I think it's a grown-up way of debating it. Anyone who says that Scotland can't be independent, this is an absurd argument. Of course Scotland can be independent.
Your solution for the Scottish currency question is that it just uses sterling,
yes,
not as part of some official deal with England or the rest of the UK, but it just says we're going to use your currency. I mean, why shouldn't we?
Yes.
The only problem with that is that if it needed to sort out its banks by, for example, getting help from the central bank, it wouldn't have its own central bank to help its banks, or RBS in particular. What is the solution to Scotland's huge banking sector, if it just borrows a currency from another country?
Well, the banks it's got now are essentially, in essence, UK banks, even if in some cases the gold plate for the head office is in Edinburgh. But actually, that would have to move to London. But there's no reason why the banks, any of the British banks which operate branches in Scotland, would want to change what they're doing. They make money out of the business now. They will carry on making money out of it. So I don't think
but
it's
head
a
offices in
change.
London is the cost of that particular.
Yes, it is. But I don't think the people don't have to move. You know, I mean the
brass plate has to move.
The brass plate moves, but actually where the mind and matter are doesn't change in any sense. Most of it is in London now anyway. So I don't think that's a big question. I think the problem for those who want to argue for independence is that in terms of this monetary solution, it certainly removes, in my view, the argument against independence, but it does so at the cost of making absolutely clear that Scotland would have no independent say over monetary policy. It would have to just accept the monetary policy that was coming out of the Bank of England in London, and it would accept the supervision of the Bank of England. Now that's why I think in the last referendum neither side were prepared to confront this objectively. The Westminster government didn't want to admit that there was a solution to the currency problem because they wanted to run the argument of Project Fear, and the Scottish nationalists were very nervous about saying, but actually we'd no longer even have a Scottish nationalist member of Parliament sitting on the Treasury Committee grilling the governor.